Welcome to the Next Pivot Point podcast. This season, I am focused on sharing stories and ideas from global experts on diversity and inclusion. My purpose is to share diverse stories so that you can learn from others' lived experiences and walk away with actionable strategies to lead even more inclusively. I share this information because inclusive leadership is a journey. It requires bravery and courage, and you do not have to do it alone. At Next Pivot Point, I believe we are stronger together as allies. Let's meet this week's guest. Welcome to this week's episode of the Next Pivot Point podcast. I am super excited to be joined by this week's guest, who is another fantastic expert in the diversity, equity, and inclusion space. Her name is Stacia, and Stacia Garr comes to us with an amazing background as a researcher, thought leader on talent management, leadership, D&I, people analytics, and HR technology, a frequent speaker and writer. Her work has been featured in Fortune, Forbes, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, as well as numerous HR trade publications. She co-founded Red Thread Research in 2018 after leading talent and workforce research for 8 years at Burson by Deloitte. Before Burson, Stacia spent nearly 5 years conducting research and creating learning content for the Corporate Leadership Council, part of CEB and Gartner. She has an MBA from the University of California, Berkeley, a master's degree from the London School of Economics, and an undergraduate degree from Randolph-Macon Women's College. So excited to have you, Stacia. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me today. It's wonderful to be here.
Wow, well, what a rich academic background you have and research background you have, which is a new lens for our guests on the podcast. And I always love to start with the question, like, how do you get into the diversity workspace? How do you find yourself to this work? Because, until it was kind of cool here the last year or so, I think everybody's path is kind of serendipitous, circuitous, if I can say that word correctly. And how we find our way to this work is always a fascinating story. So let's start there, Stacia. How'd you get into this?
Yeah, so I think my story in some ways was a story of putting off the inevitable. So my mother was she was always very focused on kind of women's, and my dad would say, oh, those feminist notions and that kind of thing. But she was very strong proponent of women and women's rights, and actually herself went to law school at the age of 40 and just did some incredible things. And then, as you heard from my bio, I eventually actually went to a women's college and kind of had very much so that perception, or at least that understanding that, different environments and people have different backgrounds and different strengths and all this stuff. But after grad school, the first time, the LSE, I started work as a researcher, and I kind of, in my head was like, okay, I got to be serious. I got to focus on like these core business issues and understand, I was focused on performance and leadership research at CEB. And so it was very much so kind of in that vein, if you will. And I always had this interest, particularly around generations at that time, because it was when Gen Y was starting to come into the workforce, and people were very interested in that, that group and how it was so different and all this other stuff. But I kind of felt like I didn't want to focus specifically on particularly women, but also ethnicity, because I don't know. I for some reason I thought, I needed to focus on serious things, which is like so funny to think about, right? Like the naivete of youth.
I can totally relate to that. My mom being like, "You should do things with helping women." I'm like, I'm going to go work in corporate America. That's a real job.
Exactly. Like what? But anyways, so fast forward, and I was working at Burson, and we were actually acquired by Deloitte, and Deloitte has a very big focus on diversity and inclusion. And so they asked me, they said, Burson doesn't have a diversity and inclusion maturity model. We don't have real, like, we've done a ton of work around it, but kind of from the Burson angle, there isn't really anything. Would you lead it? And at first I was sort of like, But then I was like, what am I doing? Why am I just not embracing this? This is so important. So that was 2013. And that was kind of the start of everything that's been since, which has been, 8 years of a lot of research and a lot of reading, and a lot of learning about this space, and a lot of writing about this space.
Well, and I know y'all just published a new report, DEIB Tech, so diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging. Words matter, acronyms matter. So I want to clarify that. But especially DEIB tech, its time has come, and we're going to link to that in the show notes so listeners dig into that report more. But tell us about your most recent research and what you're finding, the current state of diversity.
Yeah. So if I kind of pick up the story in 2013, and did all this research and in other research I'd done, we'd always ask about the tech that was enabling these people practices, whether it was leadership development or performance management, et cetera. And at the time I asked and I said, hey, what kind of tech is enabling this? And it was like I heard crickets. People were like, do you mean e-learning? I was like, no, that's not quite what I'm going for here. And so at the time, I kind of set it aside. And then a few years later, actually after my own maternity leave and starting Red Thread, said, you know what? It was immediately post Me Too. And I said, there is something here. And so we actually did a whole bunch of research, put out the first report in 2019. And then now this report, the one you just mentioned, is our second iteration of this report. We just put it out here in January 2021. And what has been incredible is just, if I reflect back on that 2013 crickets to now, we've just seen incredible growth in this market. So I should probably clarify that when we say, this market, I'm not necessarily talking about, those e-learning and technologies that I mentioned just a moment ago. But what we're talking about is really enterprise software that provides insights or alters processes or practices at the individual organizational level in support of organizations' effort to be more diverse, equitable, inclusive, and to foster belonging. So anyway, so we've just seen this big shift. In 2019, we had 105 vendors in the study. In 2021, we have 196 in the study, which is just a dramatic increase. 87% increase. We've seen a rise in the number of feature vendors. So that means those who have added features to their existing software so that it's more customized and focuses on DEIB issues and the like. And then the third thing that we really saw with this data was the rise of people analytics, using data to better measure, better understand what's happening with diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging. So those are just a few of the high level findings, but really it's just this incredible journey of change when it comes to tech.
Yeah. Well, and I find the people analytics side of thing is really interesting because something like culture historically has been really hard to measure. And we've relied on employee engagement surveys and all sorts of impractical, kind of outdated techniques. But having a pulse on your people and knowing the perspectives is often subjective and based on people's experiences and their perceptions. So being able to measure that with something like technology is really intriguing, Stacia.
Mhm.
Tell us more. If I wanted to start measuring this using technology, how would that even work?
Yeah, and I think it depends on what you're trying to measure, right? So as I mentioned in our definition, it's providing insights or altering processes or practices. But you can measure, right, the processes or the practices, or you can measure the outcomes of them. So for instance, you can measure how often do we put forth diverse candidates in our pipeline, whether that's a talent acquisition pipeline or a succession pipeline? How often do we have diverse people on our hiring slate, on our hiring boards, those who are actually interviewing the candidates? You can measure those types of practices, or you can measure, to your point, elements around culture. So we've seen a big change in the last few years in measuring belonging in particular. Yes, inclusion as well, but belonging in particular. A lot of larger vendors have put together belonging indices, which organizations can roll out either as a part of their engagement survey or as a standalone item or a standalone survey. And that gives us an opportunity to get a better sense of, if we are changing our practices and processes, is that actually having an impact on people? And then with the analytics underneath that, to look at that by different groups and to look at intersectionality within those groups and the like. So we think there's just an incredible amount that we can measure, and particularly as we go more digital, as we have, especially during the pandemic.
Yeah, yeah, especially belonging in your home, in your pajamas, behind a Zoom screen, right? What does belonging look like when you're
Yeah.
not physically connected? And this rise of cultural focus by companies, I think, doing a lot of reading myself lately and, queuing in on your research really supports what I'm seeing is having, your strength is your people right now
Hmm.
and the leaders that know how to inclusively lead through this, for lack of a better word, crisis, the
Hmm.
pandemic and social justice issues have presented to corporate America over the last year. And those that are emerging strong really had a strong focus on culture, on belonging already. And they've seen this as an opportunity to bolster that. So I'm wondering for our listeners that's like, wow, belonging in the workplace. Hadn't thought about that before. Like, what does that look like? Like, how do you do that?
Mm.
What does that everyday experience look like to create a culture of belonging?
Yeah, well, I think it starts with at the most foundational levels, psychological safety. So your leaders being, open to bad news, to people being feeling like they can say the things that they need to, without fear of retribution. So that's, I think, kind of the most basic level of this. And then I think we move on to individuals feeling, appreciated and recognized for the contributions that they make, and that they are able to do that again freely. And then, if and I know I'm kind of naturally putting this almost on a maturity curve, which wasn't my intent when I started, but
A progression. Yep.
progression, shall we say? And then I think at the top level, belonging is feeling not just that, I guess the next level is kind of, for me anyway, more of inclusion. So I feel included, I feel connected, that kind of thing. And then belonging at the top level is really, I am part of this place. This place is part of me. There's a saying that someone said once, that inclusion is, being at the dance, or being asked to, diversity is being at the dance, and inclusion is being, asked to dance. And I
Hmm.
think, to me, actually, belonging, though, is dancing no matter if you're asked.
Hmm. Yeah, feeling like it's my place
It's
to
my
dance and I
place.
can dance however I want to.
Exactly. And so, that it gets into concepts of ownership and, connection and power. For me, those are all things that are interwoven with belonging. And to your original question of how do you do that, I think, it certainly varies organization to organization. But I think that, one, if you think again along that progression, you kind of make sure that you have done each of those steps moving up to it. And then, I think the thing that I see most commonly trip organizations up are the processes and practices that disempower or reduce that ownership, that are not necessarily intended to.
That's interesting. Yeah, it's like intention versus impact. We talk a lot
Hmm.
about in the DEI space, and usually companies, usually leaders don't have bad intentions. Like
Yeah.
rarely do people get up in the morning like, can't wait to wreck belonging at this company. People don't even think about these abstract things the way
Yeah.
that you and I do consciously every day. But, I think unintentionally we create division. Unintentionally, we, microaggress those that tend to be underrepresented and not of the majority group. So all of these unintended actions over time really add up to a cumulative effect that's very harmful to a sense of belonging. So
Hmm.
thinking about our everyday leader, say you're a middle manager, somebody that manages a small team or maybe a really big team, what do you do if I wanted to foster inclusion, right? I wanted to make sure that there aren't these unintended things that are happening that maybe not even on my radar, right? They're not
Hmm.
happening to me. I don't even know they're happening to my team. Like, where do I start to lead more inclusively? Where do I start if I want to foster a sense of connection and belonging on my team?
Mm-hmm. I think it starts with openness. One of these silver linings of the pandemic has been that we saw a lot of very senior leaders in organizations say, I don't know the answer here. I know we have a problem. I don't know the answer. And whether that was with the, COVID pandemic, or really the social justice pandemic.
Yeah.
But we saw a lot of that, and I think that is the place that our, middle managers, anybody, can start. I know that we have some problems. I'm open to hearing about them. I'm open to learning. I think one thing is particularly for whatever reason in our culture right now, it's easy to jump on someone's deficiencies or lack of knowledge or lack of understanding, as opposed to understanding that they are on a learning journey too. Um, and so I think that, on the manager side, it's an openness. And then on the team side, uh, whatever background you are, it's a recognition that everyone is learning. And to your point, most people have good intention. They have an intention to understand and to be open. So that would be the first point. I think the second thing is that goes along with that statement of openness is authentic listening. In a holding back from defensiveness, an actual just, this is a different perspective than what I have, and I want to hear it, I want to honor it, and I may not ultimately agree with it, it may not be my experience, but giving that space for the conversation and to hear things that may be hard, and certainly to hear things that are different, I think is the starting point.
Authentic listening. Yeah, because I think people go to like active listening. We go to these old frameworks, and I don't know about you,
I don't know
but
if there's a framework on that. I just
no, people often overestimate their ability to actively listen to, which is so interesting because we're all pretty crummy listeners. I pride myself on really wanting to reflect back what people share with me, maintain that openness and really try to like make it not about me and just be curious to learn from the other person. Having said that, my mind keeps going while somebody's talking. And that's the hard part about authentic listening is we to shut off our brain and to just be there present for someone and create that space, like you said, for true listening and curiosity. It's a tricky battle that we almost have to fight our kind of own instincts to do.
Yeah,
And so
I think we do.
saying that it's simple, but I think in practice, and what again,
I was
if
just
I'm
going
one,
to say,
please.
Julia, it's interesting. So I have younger children, and I have been recently following this hand in hand parenting group, which is here in the Bay Area, and they're everywhere. They've got folks everywhere, but one of their practices is what's called stay listening. And the idea is that when your child is having a tantrum or is having a difficulty, they're mad at their brother or sister, whatever, you just stay there and you listen. Like, even though they're screaming and you're like in your head, I don't want to be here. You just listen, and they say things and you don't judge. You say, okay, and you just don't leave. And you kind of let the storm pass. And then at the end of it, you got to regroup and then move on. And I feel like there are some parallels to this with that stay listening. This idea that you're not judging, you're not stating, you are just listening, and you're fully present. You stay listen with them. That's kind of how I think about it.
Stay listening, hand in hand. I got to check that out. I have young children as well, and candidly, my 6-year-old just shared with me very recently that she has a friend that is a boy that is not white. And his name is Cameron. And that she was talking about him on the bus with another friend. And the girl shared back that it's illegal for them to get married. And this is stuff that's happening. And we're talking 2021, like, God. Right? Like this is coming out of 6 and 7-year-old mouths. And I was much like you, horrified. And I wanted to listen, but I found myself jumping in with like, who is this? What is her name? Like, I wanted to get to the bottom of this mystery of like, who's this horrible child? And again, taking a step back and just being there for my daughter, just to listen to her, I found that's where we ended up. Initially I didn't do so well, but taking a step back and be like, she wants to be heard. She wants to unpack this. And we probably spent, it's one of the longest conversations we've had, like 20 minutes. And at the end, she said, Mom, I think this is what racism is. And I was like, oh, she sees it. She understands it. And this is very human that we see differences. It's very human to acknowledge that this isn't right to treat people differently based on those differences. But it's almost like we have to unlearn that. You and I spend time with corporate leaders and corporations that this thinking's been baked in for many, many years. And so to undo that thinking later in life is really hard.
Mhm.
But if only we could start earlier. So that's a passion project of mine. And I think the
Mhm.
parenting, I mean, who doesn't have their hands full as a parent, a caregiver, an educator right now? And
Mhm.
another, topic to broach with our children at a time when we probably are doing a lot of teaching and guiding. And maybe
Mhm.
aren't used to doing those things. Can definitely identify. I'm curious, Stacia, one of the things I study is allyship. And
Mhm.
back to our conversation, thinking about children, I've found that unless you're being an ally at home,
Mhm.
it's really hard to show up as an ally at work, especially when the lines are more blurred than ever around personal and
Mhm.
professional relationships. How do you think people can show up, authentically in this conversation, especially that majority group, that might not
Mhm.
see themselves as a part of diversity?
Mhm.
What's your take on allyship? How does it work and how do you get started?
Yeah. Well, I mean, there are so many different approaches and perspectives, and um, I kind of share just how I try to approach it. Um, and I don't know if that's right, but
There is
um,
no one size fits all approach to this. So
yeah,
definitely want
that's
your perspective.
yeah. The way I approach it is I try to be the voice that that less represented groups don't have. So, back to my point about kind of almost, thinking that there was other serious work that needed to be done. We're in this serious work, but but because of all of history and all sorts of reasons, um, less represented people aren't. And so I see myself as their voice. So part of the reason that I've been so focused on this DEIB tech work as an example is that no one else was asking the question about where is diversity within tech, where is inclusion and belonging within all these tech systems that we use to make decisions across organizations all across the world. And so I saw kind of as a personal mission to bring that question to this, very white, very majority group, and try to be that voice. And I see that kind of consistently in whatever I do when I am in, different groups. And I say, where are people of different backgrounds? Where are people of quite frankly different genders? As a tech analyst, I'm often one of the only women in the group. And so we sometimes start there. But like in general, why are there not more people of color in this space? Why are there not more people of color in tech in general? So I feel like I see a big part of my role as an ally as bringing the conversation about different groups that other people may not think to have.
Yeah. Where are people that are different than me? Where are they at? Where am I the person that's the only one like me? And how can I be a voice in that conversation? How can I amplify the voices of others in those conversations? So that's beautiful, Stacia. I wonder, and kind of looping back to where we started with your research and just having such a rich research background for the last 8+ years on this topic, I'm curious, like, where do you think things are going with diversity, equity, inclusion? I know that's a loaded question. Who has the magic ball? Who would have seen what
Mm,
happened in 2020? But if you could, look back to look forward based on your research, where are we headed? Where do you think?
I think it only gets more important. And the reason for that, there are many of them, but one is that we have basic changing demographics, certainly in this country, but also in others, that are making the voices that may have previously been quieted, they are having a voice. So I think that that's one reason. And related, I think that whether it's because of social media or because of other reasons, individ groups are finding their voice and being able to step up. So, I mentioned Me Too in 2017, and then, social justice movements here in 2020, last year in 2020. I don't think that it's coincidence that, those groups have been able to get finally some traction. And so we think that it is the combination of the culminating effect, if you will, of people raising their voices and saying we must be heard, that is resulting in this greater openness to change in corporate America, this greater openness to people examining what hasn't worked and what we could do differently. So I think that that's the foundation that all of this goes on. I think that with that, though, once a incredibly smart D&I leader said to me, so much of D&I is about conflict management.
Yeah,
Different
it's by definition is a
right?
conflict, divergence.
Right. And so with this, there's going to be conflict. There's going to be people who have different perspectives. And so I think to prepare for it, one of the big things we need to be thinking about is what are the skills that we all need in organizations to foster and to manage DEIB. And so some, the authentic listening, conflict management. I'm sure there's a bunch of others. We're actually about to kick off a study on this. So I think we need to equip people with those skills. And it's not just, I recognize unconscious bias, like that it exists. Okay, that's great. But like, what are you going to do with that? Like in the moment, right?
If I could ask one more time to start the diversity conversation with unconscious bias, like, yes, it's a hot topic. Yes, people want to learn about it, but no, that does not cover nearly, it just scratches the surface of, like you said, the conflict resolution. It's almost like relearning how to communicate with people too, as you're talking, about authentic listening and these techniques that really require us to unlearn unhelpful behavior and learn new, more helpful, more evolved behavior.
Yeah. And I think that our, kind of the negative implications of tech, the echo chambers that we've gotten in some of our lives outside of work have not helped us with this. And so I think that there's a real opportunity for businesses here in this space, but I think it's also going to be challenging.
Yeah. Well, I love where you started with that. This bottoms up movement that's coming, kind of this groundswell that's coming from people that are marginalized. Certainly Black Lives Matter has been, a frustrated mom, right, that started it, and look at where we're at now with it being nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. I mean, it's exciting to think about what's possible from everyday people in the trenches wanting to amplify the voices of others and to just say, no, this isn't okay. This isn't acceptable. We have to do better. Saying everyone that's listening, if you think your voice doesn't matter, it absolutely does. And it's the collective voices when we all get together that makes us so much stronger. And I love all these techniques you've shared with us today, Stacia. As we wrap up, I'd love for our listeners to know where to follow you, where to see your latest research. We'll certainly post to your latest study that we talked about, DEIB in tech. But where can they learn more about you and Red Thread?
Yeah, so Red Thread is at redthreadresearch.com. We are a research membership, so that means that a fair amount of our content is behind a paywall, which enables us to do the research. But we do have quite a bit that's for free, including the link that we'll post. And then folks can also connect with me directly on LinkedIn, and then I'm also on Twitter at Stacia Garr.
Yeah, and that's with 2 R's. So look for her all those places, and we will link to that study. And I think it's really great, the work that you're doing, give people what their appetite, help them see some, some research kind of in front of that paywall, but then, to keep the lights on for you to be able to do this work, you have to be compensated. So listeners, let's make sure that we're doing good stewardship. And if we like the content, subscribe, find a way to support diversity in business. And that's a lot of times putting our money behind movements and behind people that are doing great work like you are. So thank you, Stacia, so much for sharing your expertise with our listeners today.
Well, thank you so much, Julie, for having me. I really appreciate it.
I appreciate you listening to this episode. If you like this podcast, the best way you can be an ally is to write a review on iTunes, on Spotify, on Google, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. Every review helps other allies find us. I host this podcast because I believe we are stronger together as allies.